are in a series we've entitled Sunday School, and these are God's stories that are primarily going to be in the Old Testament as we go through this summer together. And we know that many of you maybe went to church growing up and you've heard some of these stories as a kid, but some are newer to church and you've never heard some of these stories. And the music is to set it, they are epic, man. These are some crazy, amazing God stories. Really, it's God being faithful. And what our hope is that you see God was faithful then, he was faithful to them, and he will be faithful now, and he will be faithful to me. Can I get an amen on that? That's why we read these stories like, okay, that's how God works. He talks about just trust me, test me, let's go. Man, didn't Tyler do such a good job last week? I love Tyler Sorrells doing that. He kicked it off. Graduation week, it was wonderful. All those that graduated, it was just an incredible time for us around the community the last few weeks, honestly. Well, today I want to jump right into our story, and I'm going to introduce a really pivotal character in the biblical narrative, and his name is Abraham. And Abraham is known as the father of faith, and he's known as the father of faith for a couple of reasons. Number one, he's the physical ancestor of the Jewish people and other Semitic groups that live in the Middle East today. They trace their ancestry to this man, Abraham. And so he's the father of the physical lineage of God's people, but he's also the father, the spiritual father of all those who know the one true God, Yahweh. And that's because of this covenant that God makes with Abraham, which we're going to look at today, where God says, hey, through your descendants, I'm going to bless the entire world. And we know that descendant that can trace his ancestry back to Abraham was Jesus. And yes, through Jesus, the entire world has been indeed blessed. Can I get an amen to that truth, right? So Abraham is this really pivotal moment, this pivotal figure, this pivotal character in the biblical story. And we know him as Abram at first. The name Abram means exalted father. He will have his name extended or expanded to mean Abraham, which means father of nations. So we're not going to get that far in his story, but that's the name we're going to have known him today as Abram. And God does that sometimes. As people go through challenges and changes and their interaction with God, sometimes it's so profound, he changes their name. He did that for Saul, who became Paul. He named Peter. His given name was Simon, but he's like, I'm going to call you Rocky. I'm going to call you Peter. And he does this with Abraham. And so we're going to look into Abraham today. And as I said, he's the father of faith. And when I talk about faith, I want to just camp a minute on this topic of faith, because faith means different things to different people. And for some, when I talk about faith or I talk about being a person of faith, they might have a little kind of some skepticism about it. For some people, faith or being a person of faith is someone who's really not living in the real world. They're a little naive. Maybe they're not scientific. They don't look at all the facts, and they're going to look at faith, or they're going to look at the idea of living by faith as kind of, it's just kind of this naive approach to life. It's a farce. It's something that you believe in to get you through. And so that's how some people might approach a topic when I say we're going to talk about this man who's the father of faith. Others may be here today. You grew up in a really strict religious home, and for you, faith meant obedience. You don't question it. You just kind of keep your head down and your mouth shut. And you just, if you ever do have a doubt, you feel really bad about that. So you try to push your doubts down. And so for those, faith is fearful. It's kind of fearful. Others, they're newer to the faith, and it's still really confusing. You may have had some experiences with God that are true, or you think they are, but you're just not really quite sure. How do you walk by faith? What does it mean to be a person of faith? What is this all about? And so for you, faith is a mystery. But then there are others that have walked with Jesus for a while. And for you, faith is everything. You'd even die for it. And for you, it's the only thing that's certain in an uncertain world. And so for you, faith is foundational. And I don't know where you're at on your faith journey. And we're all at different places. Some of us maybe aren't really crossed that line into saying, yeah, I'm a believer yet. And that's okay. Guys, I want us always to be a community that invites the skeptics, invites the people that are struggling, because that's all of us at one point in our life. Right. So this needs to be a community broad enough where you can belong even before you believe. Like just come and follow Jesus with us and let him just impact you when he's ready and when you're ready. And so I want us to be that kind of a place. Wherever you're at in this journey, I think that the story today will teach us a lot about faith and a lot about the biblical truths that God wants to bring into our life through this story of Abraham. So let's dive in. Genesis chapter 12 is where we meet him. As I said, his name is Abram here. And all we know about him from the earlier chapter in Genesis, chapter 11, is that he's married to a woman named Sarai who can't have children. We learn a little bit about his family history, his lineage. And then we really get him spotlight front and center here in chapter 12, where God appears to him. And so let's look at this. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you. And I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse." And here it is. "And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So this is a little kind of a hint or a little foreshadowing of how the story of Abraham is going to impact every human on the planet. And we have already said that because Jesus is part of these descendants of Abraham, and that through him, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed. So I want you to picture Abram for a minute. Abram he's this guy living in the Bronze Era. You know, they kind of date him to around 2000 BC. He lives in a sea of polytheism. I mean, everyone's a polytheist. There's all these gods. These gods are scary. You try to figure out how to wrangle blessings from them through sacrifices. There's not a loving God. You know, there's not a sense of God loving us. This is kind of the religious background that Abram would have grown up in. And we know he lives in this town called Ur. And Ur, we're not 100% sure where Ur is. There's a couple of, when I got some research on it, there's a couple of possibilities of where it is. But we know it's this region in the Middle East where there's lots of different deities. And they're, as I said, sometimes they're angry. Sometimes they require child sacrifice. I mean, this is rough. I mean, just a terrible just time even in human history. And not only is that's the kind of the religious scene, outside of that, you have just a lot of instability in the world. Most of the people lived in these walled cities to keep themselves safe because there could be marauding bands of just bandits that would just kind of take advantage of people that weren't in safe, protected areas. Not to mention you had kings and empires that are starting to kind of emerge in this time of history. And so people are kind of held up in these walled cities. They each have their own deities that they sacrifice to. And so that's kind of the setting that Abram lives in. So if you can picture Abram for a minute, he's grown up in this setting. He's polytheistic. There's lots of different deities. They're not really nice. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he has this profound spiritual experience with this God that he doesn't know. And this God is making these grand promises and he calls him to leave everything he knows. And isn't that interesting? Doesn't faith always start that way? It starts with an invitation. It always does. Whenever God comes to someone, it's always an invitation to come and follow me, to come away from where you're at, to go on a journey. Whether that's a physical journey or a spiritual journey, there's always a step, an invitation to follow God. And every one of you have had that kind of experience. If you're in a relationship with God, you could point to a moment where you felt this prompting. And sometimes you don't realize it in the actual moment, but when you look back on it, you do. For you, it might have been that person that showed up at your job. They were hired on, and you end up working with this person, and man, they started talking about God, and you've never been around anyone like that, and you look back and you say, that was when God was first starting to get a hold of my attention. It was when this guy, or this gal started working at my company, and they were different. I was interested in that. Or maybe it was a situation where you just felt like, man, you were in a tough place. You had hit the bottom. And maybe for the first time you looked up and you cried out. And looking back now, you say, that's when I felt that invitation. I knew there was somebody out there, and I didn't know much about who he was or what this was, but I said something like, hey, God, if you're out there, I want to know who you are. And maybe looking back, you say, that's when God got my attention. Or maybe there was another, just a set of these, what you thought at the time were these crazy coincidences, but you now realize that wasn't coincidence at all. There was God moving heaven and earth to pull you to himself. I don't know your story, and I don't know if you've had that encounter yet. Maybe today you're here and this is part of that. You'll look back and say, it was in that sermon. I heard God speaking to me, But that's Abraham. He gets this meeting with God, and now God's pulling him out. And I want to point out that he's asking him to leave everything that's familiar and to trust God into the unknown. And leave your home, leave your people, leave your father, and all the inheritance that's yours. Hey, guys, leave the walled city that keeps you, that you think is keeping you safe. And I'm gonna take you somewhere crazy. I'm gonna take you somewhere awesome. Guys, I want to point out, God never asks you to get rid of something or to let go of something if he isn't planning to fill it back up for you. God needs to empty your hands before he can fill them. He needs to say, look, you're holding on too hard to this, and you think this is all you know, and this is how logically it works for you. But if you'll just trust me, I promise you, if you just let go of this, I promise you, I have something so much better for you. Think about it, guys. Leave your land to gain the promised land. Come on, right? Leave your people to become a great nation, right? Leave your father's inheritance to have the greatest name in human history outside of Jesus himself. Like, that's what God is saying to this guy, Abram. We're here today because Abram had this encounter with God, and he just says, okay, I'll take this. I'll respond. All right, I got to keep going. Here we go. So let's move on. So I want you to think about how scary this was. I'm leaving everything that I know and this protection of this city, and I'm supposed to travel to this new land. So let's look what happens in verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. That's his nephew. And Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. That's the town that he was in. Verse 5, he took his wife Sarai, who we know can't have children, his nephew Lot, and all the possessions they'd accumulated, and the people they'd acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the great tree of Moreh at Shechem, and at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. That's an interesting little detail just to know this isn't just an unoccupied piece of real estate. There are other people there, and they're not that nice, okay? I'm just gonna point that out. And so here's Abram. He's leaving everything that he knows, and he's going to travel. And I've got a map for you to kind of picture this. It's about a 500-mile trip down south from Haran, where he was, and he's going to travel all the way down into what we call the Promised Land today, really close to Jerusalem today, is where he's going to end up in a place called Bethel in a minute. And he's in a tent. He's not in a house, in a fortress, behind a wall. He's out there. And what a picture that is for us sometimes. Faith makes us feel very vulnerable, doesn't it? I mean, walking by sight is a lot more seemingly safe than walking by faith, right? It's a lot safer to say, well, let me hedge my bets. Let me get everything figured out. Let me control the situation, because walking by faith requires a certain level of vulnerability that I'm not comfortable with. Anybody else there with me? But when we talk about praying, to God, I mean, what am I doing? I'm talking to who? I think God. I hope God, right? And I'm asking God to hear me and change things and move and do what only he can do. And man, I tell you, have you ever been vulnerable in that state? Like, God, are you even listening to me? How do I know this even works? We are obsessed with things that work, aren't we, as Americans, right? Does this work? Have you ever asked that question? And so what a great picture of Abram just kind of in this place of vulnerability. I'm going to leave the protection of my safety, of my familiarity, and I'm going to step into the unknown. I know some of your stories. I know some of you have done that. You've taken steps into the unknown. You've sensed the Lord prompting you, and you took a step. Look at verse 7. It goes on. It says, the Lord appeared to Abram. I love that. I think God always appears to people after they take steps of faith. Has God been silent? maybe you haven't listened to the last command and he's just waiting still. But once you take that step, okay, God, I'm taking that step, bam, here he is. Okay, I was waiting and now we're ready to continue. It's kind of like, I'll just wait for you when you're ready. Let's go. So God appears to Abram and he says, and he's down there in this place and he says, I will give this land to your descendants. Remember, his wife can't have children. Just keep that in your mind. I'm going to give this land to your descendants. And so Abram, he builds this altar there and he dedicates it to the Lord, to Yahweh. Whenever you see in the Bible, the all caps, we're talking about Yahweh. We're talking about the one true God of Israel. We're not talking about, any other kind of like Elohim, or which would be a more generic name for God, like the gods. It's just specific. So he's building it to Yahweh, and the same God who would appear to him. And going on to verse 8, it says, after that, Abram traveled south and set up camp in the hill country with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east, and there built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord. And notice this, and he worshiped the Lord there. And then Abram continued traveling south by stages toward the Negev, which is the desert area all the way close to Egypt. So basically what Abram's doing is he's entering this land that God's promised him, and he keeps kind of like marking it out with altars. And as he travels through, he's like, okay, this is dedicated to Yahweh. This is dedicated to Yahweh. And he's literally walking the entire length and breadth of what we call the promised land today. What a wonderful story. And if that was the end of the story, you'd be like, okay, that's cool. So God appears to this guy and that's it. And that's not the story of faith though, is it? Whenever we first encounter God and we first have these moments, it does start off really with a lot of joy. When you finally meet Jesus and you realize, oh my goodness, man, there is something bigger than me. I'm not alone. Man, the amazing feeling of feeling forgiven for your sins, the weight off your shoulders. I love it when, like last week, we baptized 4 people and everyone comes out of the water the same. I mean, they come out of the water on fire. It's weird. It's kind of funny, right? But spiritually, they're sopping wet, but brother, they are on fire. Because the Spirit is just baptized them. They are ready to just tell everyone about Jesus. I love being around new believers. And there's these smiles, these tears, there's joy. But faith doesn't always stay that way, right? As you continue your journey with God, life doesn't always stay, blue skies and rainbows. We have an enemy that wants to continue to discourage us and get our eyes off of the Lord. And this is what happens next in Abram's life. Verse 10, let's look at it. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram lives in this new land. He's far away from his homeland and everything's fine so far. And he's getting all these promises from Yahweh, but he's in this very vulnerable place. He lives in a tent. And not only does he live in a tent, but the land itself is not really well watered if there's no rain. Canaan is really kind of vulnerable to the seasons and the droughts that can kind of arise in that part of the world. In fact, it's almost by design, I think, God says that he wants the people to live in a land that depends on rain, that makes them depend on Yahweh. And so this is one of these famines that kind of hit that area of the world. And so Abram has to make a choice. Like, what am I going to do? There's no rain. My crops and everything else isn't going to work out. So Abram goes down to Egypt to live there. Now, Egypt is a kind of it plays an interesting role in the biblical story. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but Egypt is this more regular, safe place to go to. It's got regular crops because the Nile River floods every season. Every annual season, there's this flooding that occurs, and the irrigation that can happen from the Nile River makes Egypt more predictable than Canaan. And so he travels down there because the famine's severe. And as he's about to enter Egypt, he says to his wife, I know what a beautiful woman you are. Okay, pause. Now, he isn't trying to like sweet talk her here. He's actually trying to prepare her for what potentially is going to be a problem in Egypt. Remember, he's left the safety of his family. He's left everything. He's about to go to this foreign land. He doesn't know anybody down there. And he looks over and he goes, I got a smoking hot wife. And I know what people do with strangers with smoking hot wives coming into their country. They take them and they kill their husbands. And I don't know what I'm going to do. Guys, this is a storm in Abraham's faith. What do you do when you have a storm in your faith? When your trust is tested, when life goes wrong, when all of a sudden the promises and the altars and all the joy that you experienced, you were in church and things were going right, and you had these promises that you believed, and now there's a famine and you're leaving the promised land, and you're headed to Egypt and you're scared. You know, guys, the trials reveal our trusts. When you go through a trial, it reveals what you're really trusting. What is your go-to? What are you going to do? Because we're tempted to control the situation. Chris and I were talking about this. There's this constant comparison in Scripture between living by faith or living in fear. And those are the two options. And friends, I know it. Man, we are humans. We are naturally afraid. When we are in situations where we don't know the future, we don't know what's going on, it is natural to be afraid. And in those moments when we most need faith, we tend towards fear. And when you're afraid, you grasp at everything. How can I control this? What can I do to make this okay? And you know what we don't do? We don't go to the one who holds it all, right? We walk by our own eyes and we walk by our own decisions. And so what does Abram do? Here we go. Look what he does. Here he says this. He goes, when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but you will live. So say that you're my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. So this is a plan. This is what makes sense. This is what, living by sight. I don't know if I can trust Yahweh, so I'm going to have to trust myself. So we're going to come up with this plan, And when they talk about you, I'm going to say, hey, this is my smoking hot sister, okay? And maybe that'll just be better for me. Verse 14. So when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarah was very beautiful. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle and male, female donkeys and male and female servants and camels. This is really interesting in the Hebrew, this Hebrew word to see and then to take actually connect back to the Eden story. When Satan is tempting Eve, and Eve sees the fruit and then she takes it. This is like an echo of that same story where humans have this tendency to see something that makes sense and to reach out and take them. That's not ours. Now, Pharaoh, you could say, doesn't know that Sarah's unavailable, but this is like that same human tendency. And I was thinking about this. Here's Abram. I want you to picture Abram here. He's got himself in this jam. He's down there in Egypt. And he's saying that she's his sister. And now I want you to picture like this. I wonder what the inner dialogue was for him as he's like seeing this trade that happened. Like, here's my wife, and then I get this donkey. Like, really? Like, that's the trade here, right? He's just got to be dying inside. He's just got to be so like, what am I doing? Why am I here? Have you ever felt like you just made a mess of your life? You stepped outside of faith and you end up in fear and you make a mess of your life and you just think, man, now I'm going to live with these consequences. And I traded Sarah for a donkey. Like, what is going on right now? This isn't how my life was supposed to be. Guys, what I love about the Bible, it's not filled with stories of people with like incredibly perfect lives that never make mistakes. It's not filled with these superheroes that I can't relate to. It's filled with people with flaws that when they're tested, they don't always make the right choice, right? And here's what you learn, guys, and this is so great. I'm so glad that our flaws don't stop God's faithfulness. I'm so glad that when I make mistakes, God's like, well, I guess this is over. It was fun while it lasted. Hey, have fun with those donkeys. See you later. I'm out. Like, aren't you glad that that's not what happens with Abram's story? That yes, he messed up, and yes, he was lying to Pharaoh, but God. And that's how the next verse starts. Come on, look at this. Chapter 12, verse 17. But the Lord. I love this. Inflicted. Okay, we're going to get to that in a second. Okay, so here's Abram. He's in this really bad situation. He's really messed up his story. The entire promise, all the covenant God's had in plan for Abram is now in the balance because now Sarah is in Pharaoh's palace and whatever's going on and Sarah, right? And so here's what the Lord does. He inflicts some serious diseases on Pharaoh. I do not know what these serious diseases were. All I know is it had something to do with the inability to continue with the relationship with Sarah. Let's put it that way, all right? So God is like, no, this is not gonna happen. I'm gonna make sure it doesn't happen, and I'm gonna inflict some serious hurt on Pharaoh and his household because they've got Sarah, they've got Abram's wife in the palace. So Pharaoh figures it out somehow, and he summons Abram, and he says, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? And then he says in verse 19, he says this, why did you say she's my sister? So that I took her to be my wife. Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. This is actually a little foreshadow of what's going to happen with the whole nation of Israel centuries later. They're also going to be in Egypt. And they've also been driven to Egypt because of famine. And in that story, they're going to be, as we heard a little bit last week with Tyler, they're going to be under Pharaoh's control. But in the end, Yahweh's going to take them out of that place and they're going to spoil the Egyptians too. And here's the funny part of this story. Abram takes wife, but he also takes the donkeys and stuff too. He takes it all out of Egypt, which is kind of hilarious. And so here we are with a very flawed hero in our story, a very flawed person. The father of faith lies. And this isn't the only time he does it. If you know your story, if you know this story, he's going to lie about Sarah again to another king. This is going to be a difficult thing for him to really get through. And in fact, he kind of passes on this trait to his son Isaac. He's known for deceiving. And also Jacob, he's actually known as a deceiver. Isn't that interesting that the patriarchs of the Bible, the ones that the line of Jesus comes through, are these flawed people who sometimes don't always take the right steps. Sometimes they do, and it's great, but it's really, really like us. I want to go to one more part of his story, though, because this is where it all shows just how powerfully faithful God is. So in chapter 12, we have this experience now. He's out of Egypt. He's back in the promised land. He's with his nephew Lot. He's got a few more donkeys than he had before, but here he is. And now he's there, and Lot and him are starting to develop their wealth, and they have to separate. Lot separates from Abram, and Lot chooses the walled cities. He's choosing protection. Abram's choosing to live in the tent in faith. As a result of Lot's choice, he ends up getting caught in this terrible mess with all these people. And as a result, Lot almost dies, and Abram has to rescue him. And God delivers Lot through Abram. At the end of that story, which we're not going to go into in chapter 14, God shows up once more, and Abram really knows that Yahweh is faithful. But I want to go to chapter 15, because there's something else that he doesn't know about Yahweh yet, that no one knows about Yahweh, that I think is a beautiful place for us to end today. And this is in verse 1. This is after all that happened with Lot, and Abram's been able to rescue him. And now it's just God and Abram one more time. The word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. And he says to him, don't be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. I want to stop there for a second. They've been through a lot. God and Abram their relationship has grown. They've gone through the Egypt scenario and the Egypt, episode. They've gone through the rescuing Lot episode, and they've known each other. He's realized, okay, Yahweh's really there. He's really helping me. And now they're at this other moment. And God just shows up and he says, hey, you can trust me. I'm your shield. Remember, you don't need the walled city. You can live in the tent. I'm going to protect you. I protected you even when Lot was going crazy. I still protected you. And look what it says, though. But Abram said, guys, you realize this is the first time we ever read anything that Abram says back to God. They've been together for 3 chapters. This is the first time Abram speaks back to Yahweh. And I want to show you what he says. He says, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain, what's the word? Childless. Abram started this relationship with Yahweh, he was 75. Sarah, I think, is 10 years younger. So they're already getting the senior discount at Denny's, okay? They're already there. And, it's been years now. And there's been battles, and there's been deliverance, and there's been all this stuff. And he's grateful. But there's this nagging thing that's never been resolved. And it's this. We've never had kids. God, you're talking about these descendants. You're talking about all this stuff, and we can't have kids. And we're not young. And he goes, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus, one of his servants. Verse 3, it says this. You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. I really think this shows growth in Abraham's relationship with God. I think it was, before this, he was probably too afraid to kind of be honest with God about this, right? Remember, he's learning who Yahweh is. This shows growth. This shows that Abraham's at the point where he's like, okay, I'm gonna test the waters here. Can I push back a little bit here? Can I just address this elephant? You've been talking about all these descendants and I don't have any kids. I need to talk to you about this. Guys, can I say something to you? It is not wrong to take your struggles and your doubts to the Lord. Instead of burying those because you're afraid, I don't know if I'm supposed to do that, or I don't know, I was taught in a church environment that I grew up in, just, kind of keep your mouth shut and keep your head down. Guys, friends, listen, that is not a real relationship. When you're struggling, tell God. When you're having confusion, I don't know why this is happening. Why is it still in my life? Why hasn't this been resolved? Tell God about it. Guys, that's not a lack of faith. That's growth in faith. That's when you're saying, God, I know, man, if we can have a real honest relationship, why do we have a relationship? I mean, if you're married to someone and you can't bring up any problems in the relationship, then hey, this isn't real, because real relationships address the elephants that are in the room. And this is an elephant in the room between him and God. Why don't I have any kids, God? Look at what Yahweh does. Now, Yahweh's got a plan. He actually wants him to wait longer so that when he does have kids, it's a real miracle. He's going to make him wait a little longer, but he's going to give him something in between. Watch this. Watch what he does here. Watch what he does. It says, then the word of the Lord came to him. He says, this man, this Eliezer guy, he's not going to be your heir. But a son who's your own flesh and blood will be your heir. So this is the most clear God has been about how these descendants are going to happen. He is being crystal clear with him. He's like, look, you are not going to give your inheritance to some servant, and that's how you're going to have descendants, through this other person. That's not how it's going to happen. You're going to have a son from your own flesh and blood. He's going to be your kid. He goes on, he says this. He says, let's go outside. I want you to look up at the sky. I want you to count the stars, if indeed you can count them. That's how many offspring you're going to have. You imagine what the sky looked like 2,000 years BC, no light pollution. You imagine that? You imagine what that looked like? You have to go to the top of some island in the middle of the ocean to see something like that, right? They saw that every single night, the Milky Way galaxy and the trillions of stars. He says, can you count them? In verse 6, it says, Abram believed the Lord, and he, God, credited it to him as righteous. He's like, yeah, that's my boy. You just believe me right now. You just trust that's true. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to take possession. All those years ago, we've been together for 20 years at this point. We've been wrestling through this. I'm the same guy, and I'm going to give you this land to take possession of it. But notice this. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know it? How can I know it? Yes, you're reaffirming that this is the plan, and I believe you, but man, can you give me something? I want to show you what God does. He says, all right, I hear you. I'm not ready to give you Isaac yet. That's who's coming. Because I want it to get really desperate. And then I'm going to give you Isaac, okay? But I hear you. Here's what I want to do. Abram, go grab some animals that are normally sacrificed to the gods. And what I want you to do, you're not going to make a sacrifice with these animals, but I want you to do something. I want you to cut them in half. Goats and sheep. Some birds, but you're not going to cut the birds in half. I don't know why. It's for a different day, whatever, okay? And you're gonna put them in 2 rows. As soon as Abram was told to do that, he would say, wait, I know what this is. Because there was a custom in those days. If you had a king and that king was able to kind of like conquer another king, they would enter into like an agreement, kind of like a forced agreement, like you will agree, yes, I will agree kind of deal. And it was called cutting a covenant. Actually, the term cutting a deal comes from that. So we use that term cutting a deal. It comes from this cutting a covenant. And what they would do is they would take these animals, they would cut them in half, and the two kings, the one who just got kind of conquered, and the other one said, okay, we're gonna make an agreement. You're gonna pay me taxes, I'm gonna take care of you. Yes, yes, okay. We're gonna walk through that covenant together. And the meaning for the animals was, if either of us break the covenant, may what happened to the animals happen to me. That was the symbolism. So these animals got split apart. Doesn't look like it felt really nice. So I hope it doesn't happen to me. Right. So do not break the covenant, or what happened to these animals will happen to you. Okay. It's pretty solemn. Here's the crazy part. Abraham does that all day. He's like getting it all ready. He's doing all this stuff. You can read it in chapter 15. And then all of a sudden, Abram he falls into this vision. God kind of puts him not asleep, but in like a trance. And he's there. And look what happens. This is crazy. Look what happens. When the sun had set and the darkness had fallen, Abram's like in this like trance. He's like in this paralyzed trance. He says, all of a sudden, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants, I will give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Let me explain what's happening here. Normally, this would be a bilateral agreement. 2 parties would both walk through the middle of those animals. But this is not a bilateral agreement. Abraham is set to the side, and he's in this trance, and what he sees, and this is crazy. This is like no other God ever Abram's ever noticed or ever known. God himself, represented by the blazing, smoking fire pot and the blazing torch, goes through those pieces of animals on his own, making a unilateral agreement with Abram. Says, let me translate this. Abram, our agreement isn't based on you keeping your end of the deal, because you can't. Because I know you want to be faithful, and sometimes you are faithful, but more often than not, you're going to falter. So let me help us out. I'm going to make this promise to you no matter what. I'm going to give you my promise that may what happened to me happen to these animals if I don't keep my faithful covenant to you, Abram. That's grace, my friends. That's God saying, I've got you, I've got you, I've got you. I'm not going anywhere. I know you made a mistake and you feel like that's disqualified you. I know the enemy uses that guilt and that shame to make you feel like you don't matter or you're not worthy, and you've messed it all up too much and there's no way to fix it. But friends, let me tell you, I'm making a unilateral covenant with you in the blood of my son Jesus on the cross. And I'm never going to leave you. I'm never going to forsake you. And my relationship with you is not based on your performance, what you can do for me. Friend, it's based on what I am promising to do for you. Walk in that freedom. Walk in that covenant. Guys, walk in that security, because that's what we really have offered here. And I got one more powerful verse to share with you. And it's Jesus. Thousands of years later, Jesus is being kind of in a debate with these religious leaders, and they're questioning his authority. How dare you say these things? You make yourself like your God. Who do you make yourself out to be? And Jesus says these words. Look at this in John chapter 8. He says, your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. You're not yet 50 years old, they said. You've seen Abraham? And he said, very truly, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. Let me break this down for you. All of these promises that God made to Abram, all those centuries before, are being fulfilled in Jesus, right in front of these religious leaders' eyes. The covenant promises that God said, look, I'm so guaranteeing you this promise that may what happened to these animals happen to me if I don't keep my word, are now being fully, completely fulfilled in the descendant of Abraham, Jesus, God's own son. Yahweh's own son is fulfilling these promises. And he says, Abraham was glad to see me. He saw it. Before Abraham was, I am. Whoa! Like I am the I am. I'm the blazing, smoking fire pot walking through the animals for you. I'm never going to leave you. You know, time is our problem. Because God says something here, and the fulfillment is way out here, and we're stuck in the middle. And that's where our faith falters. That's where we have those doubts, like, can I really believe what he told me is going to happen? I want to show you, I've got a little diagram for you. Here's the fire, the promise. And here's you, me, Abram. And we see this and we say, okay, God, you're promising me descendants. You're promising, but my wife's infertile, but we're gonna have all these, more than the stars. You promise all this stuff. And I'm here. And the fulfillment's way out here, but how do I know it's actually gonna happen? I wanna show you how time works for God. For us, time is linear. There's yesterday, today, tomorrow. Not for God. God's word is so sure, so guaranteed, that God takes time and he folds it in on itself. So that the distance between the promise and its fulfillment is none. They're right next to each other. It's as if, guys, listen, when God says it, it's already done. That's what it is. When God said to Abraham, you're gonna have more descendants than the stars of the sky, even though for Abram, it was far apart. For God, it had already happened. When God says, I'm keeping my promise, Abram, you could trust me. For him, it was so far off. But Jesus says he saw it and he was glad because it's me, I'm here. What do you need God what promise of God do you need to trust right now? You need to be faithful in the fold. Be faithful in the in-between, knowing that God is he's gonna close that up. And one day, guys, every knee is gonna bow, every tear is gonna be wiped dry, every heartache will be mended when Jesus himself is on the throne. And I don't know what your current Egypt is. I don't know what the famine you're struggling with is, where you're constantly wondering, can I trust God or am I gonna run to fear? Guys, can I tell you, be faithful in the folds of life, because one day it's already is done. One day, every knee is gonna bow. Every wrong will be made right. Every heartbreak will be mended. And the joy that we will have will be forever. Do not lose faith in the folds of life.